Aaron, if you decide to change things and turn off a few of these microphones, that's fine, and we can just follow your lead in terms of who's talking at what time. So please let me know if the voice from my end starts breaking up. And do. So,
It's actually a little bit more broken up than it was before. I'm going to try to turn off my microphone and see if that helps.
okay. Okay.
I'll type to you if I need to tell you anything.
I mean, we really only need probably one microphone working at a time. So let me know if I'm not coming through, and when Marjorie and Yave talk, if they don't come through. So I'm going to get started unless I hear from somebody else to hold on for a second. Welcome, everybody. It's a lovely afternoon here in Boston, Massachusetts. Hope it's a great day in Alaska and Hawaii, at least in a great day beginning. Before we get started, let me just give you an overview of where we are, where we're going for the first part of the course. These are the titles for the first 4 lectures. Last week, we covered some basic outcome measures and some measures of effect. And today, I want to talk about probably the more important topic of how you design these associations between risk factors and outcomes. Part of what I'm talking about today might carry over until next week. So next week is also looking at study designs, and we'll talk a little bit about analysis at that time. And then the fourth of the lectures that deal with basic epidemiology I'll give on October 6th. And we'll talk about the topics of confounding and bias and effect modification. And at least 2 of those topics will be at least introduced today. Now, Rachel says I'm cutting in and cutting out on my end. And same here from Patrick. So, Aaron, the question is, do you want to turn off Marjorie's and have a microphone? See if that improves it. And when they say something, you can turn off my microphone. Let's see if that happens. And if other people can give us a feedback of how the voice sounds. I'm sort of a neophyte on this, so I'm not going to be able to give much help. So, Aaron, anything you can do, please do it on that end. Aaron is turning off Marjorie's mic, and I'm turning off Yave's. Okay. Let me go ahead, but please send chats now if I'm still breaking up or if this is improving things at all. So today I want to talk about study design options, and this slide describes some of the main study designs that epidemiologists use. I'm still getting familiar with this pointer, so it's going to take a while. I want to talk today about observational studies, in which there are many. The primary ones that we'll be talking about today are cross-sectional studies, cohort studies, and maybe case control studies, but that might carry over until next week. I also want to say a few words about experimental studies. Now, the first distinction I'd like to make is the difference between an observational study and an experimental study, because in experimental studies, we also observe people, we observe outcomes, so they are just as much observational as the cohort, case control, and cross-sectional studies. But the main difference between the observational study and the experimental study is that the observational study is more passive, and the experimental study is more active. Passive and active in terms of the exposure status, the risk factor status. So, for example, if I wanted to study whether taking an aspirin every day decreases my risk of having a heart attack, one type of study I could do is I could enroll people and ask them, do you take an aspirin every day, or do you not take an aspirin every day? That would fall into the heading of an observational study, because the participants themselves are the ones who are determining whether they are an aspirin user or a non-aspirin user. But in an experimental study, the distinction is that I, as the investigator, assign people either take aspirin each day or not to take aspirin each day. And that brings up some ethical issues because I'm doing something to people that normally they wouldn't do themselves. And we'll talk about the ethics, especially of experimental studies, a little bit later today. But let's start first talking about observational studies. And the first thing I'd like to do is talk about a cross-sectional study. And one of the papers I asked you to look over the previous week was a cross-sectional study. And we'll talk about that a bit today. So first of all, what is a cross-sectional study? A cross-sectional study is a study where both the exposure status, aspirin use, non-aspirin use, and the disease status, heart disease, non-heart disease, are determined at the same time among a group of people. So basically what is a snapshot, a survey of the population at a single point in time. And what we're going to be measuring in these cross-sectional studies are the characteristics of people, including the prevalence of diseases, something we talked about last week. So for example, we have the technology to do a cross-sectional study right now. I imagine Erin could somehow turn on the cameras that some of you have and are attached to your computers. And by looking at you, and I could record whether you are a female or a male. And by looking at you, I could record whether you are paying attention or not paying attention. So, for example, I could look at Marjorie's camera and realize that Marjorie is a woman. I could also realize that Marjorie is paying close attention to everything I'm saying. It looks like she might be taking notes. So I would record her exposure status, gender, as being a female, and I'd record her outcome status, attention, as being attentive. But on the other hand, if Erin turned the camera on to Keawe's computer, he might be sitting back reading a newspaper, seeing what's on television tonight, or whether the Hawaiian Rainbows won their football game on Saturday or something like that. So I would record him as a male who is not paying attention. What I could do for each of you is I could record your gender status, male versus female. I could record your attention status, attentive, not attentive. I could do a little study to see if females are more attentive than males in terms of the participants of this program. And that would be the example of a cross-sectional study. It's a snapshot, a picture of what's happening to people at one point in time. So let's show an example of one. And in a few minutes, I'm going to ask Keawe to describe this study in more detail. But this was one of the projects one of the papers you were asked to read. It's data from let me bring the pointer up there. Data from the whole Health Research Project, the HKRP study. And as I understand it from reading the paper, it was a door-to-door census of communities of North Kahala, which is on the Big Island, the island of Hawaii, for three of you who are from Alaska and myself who are not familiar with the state of Hawaii. This was on the south, I guess, easternmost of island of the chain of Hawaiian islands. They wanted to enroll certain types of people. The criteria to be in this study is you had to have Native Hawaiian ancestry. You had to live in one of these communities in which they're doing these surveys. You had to be over 30 years of age, and you had to be not pregnant. And in addition, from my reading of the paper, they interviewed 1,100 individuals, 547, roughly a little bit more than half of them agreed to be interviewed and complete an interview. Another 495 of them, of those 574, 495 completed a acculturation questionnaire, which I'm going to ask Keawe to explain, in which you were able to group people into 4 categories. There were 348 participants who claimed to be integrated, 86 traditional, 19 marginalized, and 8 assimilated. And notice these last 2 categories contain relatively few people. I'm going to ask you about that in a second. And then finally, this is one of the pictures or figures from their paper showing in a bar diagram the 4 groups, integrated, traditional, assimilated, and marginalized. And the height of each of these bars is the prevalence of diabetes that was obtained from these individuals. Let's see, that was obtained, if I remember, by asking them to give a fasting glucose blood test. So